On the morning of March 15, 1983, Major Viktor Petrov stood in the pharmacy line at Gum department store in Moscow, clutching a prescription he couldn't fill. The paper trembled slightly in his hands, not from fear, but from exhaustion. He hadn't slept in 47 hours. Behind the counter, the pharmacist, a gray woman whose face seemed carved from the same concrete as the building itself, looked at the prescription, then at him, then back at the paper. "We don't have this," she said flatly. Victor had heard those 4 words 17 times in the past 2 weeks. 17 different pharmacies across Moscow. 17 identical expressions of bureaucratic indifference. "When will you have it?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Maybe next month. Maybe never." The medication was called vincristine. It was used to treat acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Victor's wife, Anna, had approximately 6 weeks to live without it. The Soviet pharmaceutical industry didn't manufacture it. The drug came from the West, when it came at all, through channels so convoluted and corrupt that only the very powerful or very connected could navigate them. Viktor Petrov was neither. He was, however, a senior intelligence analyst at the KGB's first chief directorate, with Level 4 clearance and access to some of the most sensitive military intelligence in the Soviet Union. As he walked out of Gum into the gray Moscow morning, Victor understood with perfect clarity what he was about to do. The thought arrived in his mind complete and terrible, like a document that had been written long ago and was only now being opened. He was going to betray his country. Not for ideology, not for money, not even for principle, for love. And in that moment, standing on Red Square with the wind cutting through his coat and the Kremlin walls rising behind him like the edge of history itself, Viktor Petrov became the thing he had spent his entire career hunting: a traitor. The year 1983 sat at the center of the Cold War like a rotten tooth, painful, infected, and impossible to ignore. Ronald Reagan had been in the White House for 2 years, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire and launching the largest peacetime military buildup in American history. In Moscow, Yuri Andropov, former head of the KGB, had assumed leadership after Brezhnev's death, bringing with him a paranoia so profound it bordered on psychosis. The 2 superpowers circled each other like wounded animals, each convinced the other was preparing for a first strike. In March of that year, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, Star Wars, a space-based missile defense system that Soviet military planners viewed as preparation for nuclear war. In September, Soviet fighters would shoot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, killing 269 people and pushing the world closer to the edge. In November, NATO would conduct Able Archer 83, a military exercise so realistic that Soviet intelligence believed it was cover for an actual attack. But these were the visible crises, the ones that appeared in newspapers and intelligence briefings. The real Cold War happened in silence. It happened in the encrypted cable traffic between Moscow Center and KGB residencies in London, Washington, and Bonn. It happened in dead drops beneath park benches in Vienna and brush passes on crowded Prague streets. It happened in the minds of men and women who lived double lives, speaking one truth to their colleagues and another to their handlers, until they no longer remembered which version was real. Viktor Petrov had spent 14 years analyzing this shadow world. He knew its architecture intimately, the tradecraft, the psychology, the quiet mechanics of betrayal. He understood that every spy, regardless of ideology, crossed the same threshold. The moment when abstract loyalty became concrete treachery. The moment when the idea of betrayal transformed into the act of it. He had studied this transformation in countless case files, reducing it to psychological patterns and predictive models. He never imagined he would experience it himself. Victor and Anna had met in 1967 at Moscow State University. She was studying literature. He was finishing a degree in international relations that would lead directly to a KGB recruitment interview. Their courtship unfolded in the careful, supervised way of Soviet youth. Walks in Gorky Park, state-approved concerts, conversations that never quite touched on anything dangerous. They married in 1969, the same year Victor completed his training at the Red Banner Institute and began work as a junior analyst in the first Chief Directorate's American department. For 14 years, their life together followed a predictable rhythm. Victor worked long hours analyzing intelligence from agents in the United States, writing assessments that moved up the chain to people who made decisions he would never see. Anna taught Russian literature at a secondary school, grading papers in their small apartment on Leninsky Prospect, while Victor sat at the kitchen table, smoking and reviewing classified reports he couldn't discuss. They never had children, a mutual decision made partly for practical reasons and partly because Anna had always been fragile, prone to illnesses that left her bedridden for weeks at a time. In January 1983, she began experiencing severe bone pain and unexplained bruising. The doctor at the local polyclinic dismissed it as anemia and prescribed iron supplements. When the symptoms worsened, Victor used his KGB credentials to get her admitted to Hospital Number 51, a facility reserved for government officials and their families. The diagnosis came on February 8th, acute lymphoblastic leukemia, advanced stage. The oncologist, a nervous man with ink-stained fingers, explained the treatment protocol with the apologetic tone of someone describing a luxury good in a country where luxury didn't exist. Chemotherapy, multiple drugs, some available, some not. The Soviet pharmaceutical industry was strong in certain areas, antibiotics, vaccines, but weak in others. Cancer drugs, particularly the newest Western formulations, were scarce. "We'll do what we can," the doctor said, which was Soviet medicine's version of a death sentence. Victor spent the next 2 weeks navigating the medical bureaucracy, calling in every favor, contacting every colleague who might have access to better hospitals or private connections. He discovered what anyone who has ever loved someone dying slowly discovers, that systems built on collective welfare collapse instantly when faced with individual suffering. The drugs Anna needed existed. They were being manufactured in factories in New Jersey and Switzerland. They were being administered to patients in London and Paris, but they weren't in Moscow, and they wouldn't arrive in time, unless Victor could make them arrive. The initial approach was almost elegant in its simplicity. On March 18th, 3 days after the encounter at GUM, Victor attended a routine interagency briefing at Lubyanka, the KGB's Moscow headquarters. The meeting concerned American satellite reconnaissance capabilities, dry material, but relevant to his work. After the briefing, he deliberately lingered in the hallway outside Conference Room 7. He knew that Colonel Oleg Gordievsky, a senior officer in the British section, typically took this route back to his office. Gordievsky appeared on schedule, walking with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned to be invisible in a building where everyone watched everyone else. "Oleg Vasilievich," Victor said, nodding. "Viktor Mikhailovich," Gordievsky replied, pausing. They had worked together briefly in 1980 on a joint analysis project. They weren't friends, no one in the KGB had friends, but they maintained professional respect. "I need advice," Victor said quietly. "Personal matter. Medical." Gordievsky's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. "This isn't the place." "I know. Perhaps we could speak somewhere else?" A pause. Then, "Sokolniki Park. Tomorrow, 4 o'clock. Northeast corner, near the fountain." It was a perfectly ordinary suggestion. 2 colleagues taking a walk to discuss a private matter. Nothing suspicious. Nothing worth reporting. Except that Oleg Gordievsky, as Victor had learned through careful reading of restricted intelligence summaries, had been under investigation by the 2nd Chief Directorate for possible contact with British intelligence. Victor didn't know whether Gordievsky was actually a British agent. The evidence was circumstantial. Unusual travel patterns, unexplained gaps in his schedule, a relationship with a suspected MI6 officer during his posting in Copenhagen. But circumstantial was enough for Victor's purposes. If Gordievsky was loyal, he would listen to Victor's story, express sympathy, and perhaps offer the name of a well-connected doctor. Nothing would come of it. If Gordievsky was compromised, however, he would recognize what Victor was really offering: access. Sokolniki Park in March was a landscape of frozen mud and skeletal trees. Victor arrived early, walking the perimeter twice to check for surveillance. He saw nothing obvious, but in Moscow, surveillance was like radiation, invisible until it killed you. Gordievsky appeared exactly at 4 o'clock, dressed in a dark coat and fur hat, indistinguishable from any other Soviet bureaucrat taking a walk to clear his head. They walked in silence for several minutes, their breath forming white clouds in the cold air. Finally, Gordievsky spoke. "You mentioned a medical problem." "My wife has leukemia," Victor said. "Advanced. She needs medication we don't have. I'm sorry to hear that. The drug is called vincristine. It's manufactured in the West. Western medicine is sometimes available through special channels, Gordievsky said carefully. If you have connections. I don't. Another silence. A babushka passed them on the path, pulling a small cart filled with empty bottles. What exactly are you asking me, Viktor Mikhailovich? Viktor stopped walking. He turned to face Gordievsky directly, abandoning the pretense. I'm asking if you know anyone who could help me obtain that medication. And I'm asking what it would cost. Gordievsky's face remained perfectly neutral, but Viktor saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. This was the moment, the threshold. That's a dangerous question, Gordievsky said quietly. I know. The kind of help you're describing would come with expectations. I understand. You work in a sensitive area. You have access to valuable material. Yes. The word hung in the frozen air between them, solid and irreversible. Gordievsky looked away, scanning the park. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I may know someone, but I need to be very clear about something. Once you start down this path, there's no turning back. You understand that? I understand. And you're willing to accept that? Viktor thought of Anna lying in the hospital bed at number 51, her skin the color of old paper, her hair falling out in clumps from the inadequate chemotherapy they'd managed to give her. He thought of the oncologist's apologetic expression. He thought of the prescription he'd carried from pharmacy to pharmacy like a prayer to an indifferent god. Yes, he said. I'm willing. Gordievsky nodded slowly. Come back here in 3 days. Same time. Come alone. Bring nothing with you. No documents, no notes. Nothing. Just yourself. Someone will make contact. He turned and walked away without another word, his footsteps crunching on the frozen path. Viktor stood alone in the park as the afternoon light faded, knowing he had just ended one life and begun another. The next 3 days passed in a strange fog of normalcy and dread. Viktor went to work at Lubyanka, analyzing intelligence reports about American defense policy. He attended meetings, wrote assessments, participated in the routine machinery of the state security apparatus. He visited Anna at the hospital, holding her hand and lying about how the search for medication was going. I think I found a source, he told her. Should have it soon. She smiled weakly. You're a good liar, Viktor. But you don't have to lie to me. I'm not lying. It's all right. I knew what I was getting when I married a KGB officer. Secrets come with the job. He wanted to tell her the truth, that he was about to commit the most serious crime imaginable, that he was doing it for her, that he would burn the entire world if it meant keeping her alive. Instead, he said, Rest. I'll be back tomorrow. On March 21st, he returned to Sokolniki Park. This time, he noticed the surveillance immediately. A man in a brown leather jacket, too young and too alert to be a casual park visitor. Second Chief Directorate, probably. Standard procedure for monitoring KGB officers who showed suspicious behavior patterns. Viktor had expected this. Anyone making unusual contacts or breaking routine drew attention. The Soviet surveillance state didn't trust anyone, least of all its own security officers. He walked to the designated corner, near the fountain that hadn't run water in years. He sat on a bench, lit a cigarette, and waited. 20 minutes passed. The man in the leather jacket maintained position near a kiosk, pretending to read a newspaper. Then a different man approached, older, wearing a thick wool coat and carrying a shopping bag. He sat down on the other end of the bench, leaving a careful distance between them. Cold today, the man said in Russian, though his accent carried a faint British undertone. Very cold, Viktor replied. I understand you're looking for medicine. Yes. Specific type. Vincristine. For leukemia treatment. The man nodded. That can be arranged, but it requires an exchange of value. What kind of exchange? Information, documents, answers to specific questions about Soviet military capabilities and intelligence operations. I'm an analyst, not an operations officer. I don't have access to agent identities or active operations. We're not asking for that, the man said. We want strategic intelligence, assessment reports, analysis of Soviet military planning, internal communications about leadership intentions, the kind of material that crosses your desk regularly. Viktor felt his throat tighten. What they were asking for was worse than agent identities in some ways. It was the intellectual architecture of Soviet power, the assessments that shaped policy, the internal debates that revealed true intentions rather than propaganda. That's treason, Victor said quietly. Yes, the man agreed. It is. But it's also your wife's only chance. The brutal honesty was almost refreshing. How would it work? We provide the medication, you provide documents, regular exchanges, secure protocols. We have methods that are undetectable if you follow instructions precisely. And if I'm caught? You won't be, if you're careful. But if you are? The man shrugged. You know the penalty. Victor did know. Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code, high treason. The punishment was execution by firing squad, carried out in the basement of Lubyanka, a bullet to the back of the head. The family notified months later with a terse official letter. I need to think about it, Victor said. You have 24 hours. Come back tomorrow, same time, same place. If you're here, it means yes. If you're not, we never had this conversation, and we wish your wife the best. The man stood, picked up his shopping bag, and walked away. Victor sat alone on the bench, smoking his cigarette down to the filter, aware that the surveillance officer in the leather jacket was watching him and writing everything down in a report that would be filed and possibly forgotten, or possibly not. That night, Victor couldn't sleep. He lay in the dark apartment, listening to the sounds of Moscow through the thin walls, arguments from the neighbors, traffic on Leninsky Prospect, the distant whistle of a train. He thought about Anna, about the 14 years they'd spent together, about the quiet life they'd built in the margins of history. He thought about his father, who had fought the Nazis at Stalingrad and believed with absolute conviction that the Soviet Union represented humanity's best hope. His father had died in 1976, never doubting, never questioning. Victor had inherited that faith, or thought he had. He joined the KGB believing he was serving something larger than himself, defending the motherland, protecting Soviet citizens from Western imperialism, advancing the cause of socialism. But now, facing the machinery of that same system crushing the one person he loved, Victor understood something he'd managed to avoid understanding for 14 years, that the state was not an abstraction or an ideal. It was a set of concrete mechanisms that sorted people into categories, useful or expendable, loyal or suspect, valuable or disposable. Anna had been categorized as expendable. The medication she needed existed. The system could have provided it, but she wasn't important enough, wasn't connected enough, wasn't valuable enough to justify the effort. In a just world, Victor thought, loyalty should be reciprocal. Service should be rewarded with protection. But the Soviet Union wasn't built on reciprocity. It was built on the principle that individuals existed to serve the collective. And when an individual's needs conflicted with the collective's convenience, the individual lost. Always. Victor had spent his career analyzing Western intelligence operations, writing reports about American and British attempts to penetrate Soviet security. He'd always viewed those attempts through an ideological lens, capitalism trying to destroy socialism, imperialism trying to weaken a rival power. But now, staring at the ceiling in the dark, he saw it differently. The man in Sokolniki Park hadn't tried to recruit him with ideology or money. He'd simply identified what Victor needed and offered to provide it. It was a transaction, clean and simple, and Victor was going to accept it. Not because he'd lost faith in socialism, not because he believed the West was better, but because the abstract ideals he'd served for 14 years meant nothing compared to the concrete reality of Anna dying in a hospital bed while bureaucrats shrugged and said, maybe next month. On March 22nd, Viktor Petrov returned to Sokolniki Park. The surveillance officer in the leather jacket was there again, more obvious this time, as if the second chief directorate wanted Victor to know he was being watched. Victor sat on the bench. He waited. The same British handler appeared, carrying the same shopping bag. He sat down, leaving the careful distance. Yes or no? The man asked. Yes, Victor said. The handler nodded. Good. Here's how this works.
Today, you get the first delivery. 2 months' supply of vincristine, properly stored and transported. Enough to stabilize your wife's condition and begin proper treatment. He set the shopping bag on the bench between them. Don't open it here. Take it home. Store it in a refrigerator. Follow the dosage instructions that are inside. You'll need to work with a doctor who can administer it properly. I have a doctor. Good. In exchange, we need your first delivery within 1 week.
We want detailed intelligence on current Soviet assessments of American nuclear modernization programs, particularly regarding Pershing II missile deployments in Europe. Include any internal discussions about potential Soviet responses. Victor felt his stomach tighten. That was exactly the kind of material he handled regularly. Assessments from KGB officers in NATO countries, analysis of American military planning, recommendations to the Politburo about countermeasures. It was also some of the most sensitive intelligence in the Soviet system. That's a significant ask for a first delivery, Victor said. It's a significant medication we're providing. Are we in agreement? Victor looked at the shopping bag. Inside was the thing that could save Anna's life. Real, tangible, immediate. Not a promise or a possibility, but an actual solution. How do I deliver the material? The handler explained the protocol. Dead drop locations in Moscow parks, chalk marks on specific walls to signal readiness, timing sequences to avoid surveillance. It was standard tradecraft, the same methods Victor had studied in counterintelligence reports about CIA operations. The irony wasn't lost on him. One more thing, the handler said. If you're caught, we can't help you. We'll deny any contact. You'll be completely alone. I understand. Do you? Because most people don't really understand until it's too late. They think they'll be careful, think they'll be smart, think they'll be the exception. But the statistics are brutal, Victor. The average duration for an intelligence source in your position is 18 months before detection. Sometimes less. Then I'll have to beat the statistics. The handler smiled slightly. That's what they all say. Good luck. He stood and walked away, leaving the shopping bag on the bench. Victor sat for a moment longer, feeling the weight of what he'd just done settle over him like a physical thing. Then he picked up the bag, stood, and walked out of the park. The surveillance officer in the leather jacket watched him go, writing in his notebook. The report would be filed, read or not read, acted upon or ignored. Victor didn't know. He only knew that he was carrying medicine in his left hand and treason in his heart, and that he would do it again tomorrow and the day after that, and every day until Anna was cured or he was caught. There was no longer any distinction between love and betrayal. They had become the same thing. The first document Viktor Petrov photographed was a 23-page assessment titled American Strategic Modernization, Implications for Soviet Defense Posture, March 1983. He did it on a Thursday evening, alone in his office on the 4th floor of Lubyanka. The building was never truly empty. Security officers patrolled the corridors, night shift analysts worked in adjacent departments, surveillance cameras recorded every entrance and exit. But Victor had spent 14 years learning the rhythms of this place. He knew that between 7 and 8 p.m., the 4th floor corridor was typically deserted. He knew that the camera outside his office had a blind spot near the filing cabinets. He knew that if he kept his office door closed and his desk lamp on, anyone passing would assume he was working late, which was unremarkable for a senior analyst. The camera he used was a Minox C, the same model the CIA provided to its sources. Small enough to conceal in a palm, capable of photographing documents quickly and clearly in low light. The British handler had given it to him during their second meeting, along with detailed instructions on exposure settings and film development. Victor's hands shook as he positioned the first page under his desk lamp. He told himself it was just nervousness, the natural anxiety of doing something dangerous for the first time. But he knew it was more than that. It was the physical manifestation of a moral threshold being crossed, the moment when abstract betrayal became concrete action. He pressed the shutter. A soft click, barely audible. The sound seemed impossibly loud. He photographed the second page, then the third. His hands steadied as the mechanical process took over. By the time he reached page 23, he was working efficiently, almost automatically, his mind detached from what his body was doing. When he finished, he returned the document to the classified safe, spun the combination lock, and pocketed the Minox and its tiny film cartridge. The entire operation had taken 17 minutes. He sat at his desk for a moment, breathing carefully, waiting for his heart rate to normalize. Nothing had changed. The office looked exactly as it had before. The corridor outside remained silent. The building continued its night rhythms, indifferent to what had just occurred within its walls. Victor had expected to feel something dramatic, guilt, fear, shame. perhaps even liberation. Instead, he felt only a strange flatness, as if he'd performed a tedious administrative task. He put on his coat, gathered his briefcase, and left the building through the normal exit, nodding to the security officer at the checkpoint. Outside, Moscow was dark and cold. Snow had begun falling again, small flakes that dissolved immediately on the wet pavement. Victor walked to the nearest metro station, descended into the fluorescent-lit tunnels, and rode the train to Leninsky Prospect Station. He climbed the stairs back to street level, walked 3 blocks to his apartment building, and rode the elevator to the 6th floor. Inside the apartment, he removed his shoes, hung his coat, and went directly to the bedroom. Anna was sitting up in bed, reading. She looked better than she had in weeks. Her color had improved. The constant pain had diminished. The vincristine was working. "How was your day?" she asked. "Routine," Victor said. "Meetings, reports, the usual. You work too hard. Someone has to keep the Americans from destroying us," he said, and the automatic propaganda phrase felt like ash in his mouth. He kissed her forehead, told her to rest, and went to the kitchen. He made tea, sat at the small table, and stared at the wall. In his pocket, the Minox felt like a bomb. The dead drop location was in Izmailovsky Park, beneath a specific bench near the western entrance. Victor executed the drop on Saturday afternoon, during his usual weekend walk, a routine he'd established over several years, unremarkable enough that surveillance, if it existed, wouldn't notice the pattern change. He placed the film cartridge in a magnetic container, knelt to tie his shoe, and attached the container to the underside of the bench in a single smooth motion. The entire action took less than 3 seconds. He stood, continued his walk, and left the park. 4 hours later, a British intelligence officer retrieved the container during her own carefully timed visit to the park. By Monday morning, the photographs were being analyzed at MI6 headquarters in London. By Tuesday, copies were being shared with the CIA. By Wednesday, American analysts were comparing Victor's intelligence against their own assessments, marveling at the level of access their new source possessed. They gave him a cryptonym, Sentinel. Victor would never know this name. He would never know how his intelligence was being used, which decisions it influenced, which operations it enabled. He was simply a source, a point of origin for information that flowed into a vast machinery he couldn't see or understand. In the language of intelligence work, he had become a productive asset. In the language of Soviet law, he had become a traitor. In his own mind, he remained simply a husband trying to save his wife. The British handler, Victor never learned his real name, had been honest about one thing. The arrangement became routine with disturbing speed. Every 2 weeks, Victor photographed classified documents from his office. Every 2 weeks, he executed a dead drop in one of Moscow's many parks. Every 2 weeks, a new supply of vincristine appeared in a prearranged location, along with any additional medications Anna needed. The technical aspects of the tradecraft became second nature. Victor learned to photograph documents quickly and efficiently, to vary his routes to dead drop locations, to create plausible cover stories for any unusual behavior. He learned to live with constant low-level anxiety, the background radiation of knowing that discovery meant death. But what surprised him most was how little his daily life changed. He still went to work every morning, riding the metro to Lubyanka. He still attended meetings, wrote intelligence assessments, participated in the routine business of the first chief directorate. He still had lunch with colleagues in the building cafeteria, discussing office politics and football scores. No one suspected anything. Why would they? Viktor Petrov was exactly what he appeared to be, a loyal, competent, somewhat boring KGB analyst who'd been doing the same job for 14 years. He had no unusual spending habits, no suspicious contacts, no ideological doubts. His wife was sick, but that was a personal tragedy, not a security concern. The second chief directorate's surveillance, the leather-jacketed officer in Sokolniki Park, had been routine monitoring triggered by Victor's initial unusual contact with Gordievsky. When nothing suspicious followed, the case was closed. Victor's name was removed from the active watch list. He was, in the terminology of counterintelligence, cleared. This should have been reassuring. Instead, it terrified him. If he could betray his country this easily, if the surveillance state could miss such an obvious compromise, what did that say about the system he'd believed in for so long? Victor had spent 14 years reading intelligence reports about Western agents operating in the Soviet Union. He'd always assumed those agents were exceptional, unusually clever, extraordinarily skilled, perhaps ideologically motivated. Now he understood the truth. They were just ordinary people who'd made a choice and learned to live with it. The Soviet security apparatus wasn't weak or incompetent. It was simply facing an impossible task, monitoring 200 million people for signs of disloyalty. The system worked through statistics and probability, flagging outliers and investigating deviations from normal behavior. But Victor wasn't an outlier. He was maintaining his normal life precisely, adding only one additional element that was carefully hidden within legitimate patterns. He was invisible because he chose to remain ordinary. Anna's condition improved steadily through April and May. The oncologist at hospital number 51, initially pessimistic, became cautiously optimistic. The leukemia was responding to treatment. The cell counts were improving. If the progress continued, Anna might achieve remission. "Where are you getting this medication?" the doctor asked during one appointment, his tone suggesting he already knew he wouldn't receive an honest answer. "A colleague with connections," Victor said. The doctor nodded slowly. "These connections must be very good. This is high-quality material. Western manufacture, properly stored, correct dosage. Whoever is supplying this knows what they're doing. I'm fortunate." "Yes," the doctor said, and something in his voice suggested he understood exactly how unfortunate that fortune was. Very fortunate. Victor wondered how many other Soviet citizens were in similar positions, trading something valuable for access to resources the system couldn't or wouldn't provide. How many engineers were selling technical specifications? How many scientists were sharing research data? How many officials were providing information in exchange for medicine, food, travel documents, or simply the ability to live with dignity? The corruption wasn't ideological. It was structural, the inevitable result of a system that promised collective welfare but delivered selective scarcity. And the tragedy was that no one could acknowledge this reality. To admit that the system failed individual citizens was to admit that the entire ideological foundation was flawed. So everyone pretended. Officials pretended the system worked. Citizens pretended to believe them. And in the gaps between pretense and reality, people like Victor made their quiet bargains with foreign intelligence services. The first sign of danger came in June. Victor was summoned to a meeting with Colonel Vasily Zhukov, deputy director of the American department. Zhukov was a veteran officer, 62 years old, with a face like weathered stone and eyes that missed nothing. "Sit down, Viktor Mikhailovich," Zhukov said, gesturing to a chair. Victor sat, keeping his expression neutral, his heartbeat carefully controlled. "I've been reviewing your recent work," Zhukov continued, opening a file folder on his desk. "Your assessments of American strategic capabilities. Very thorough, very insightful. Thank you, Comrade Colonel. In fact, they're so thorough that I'm curious about your sources. You're drawing some conclusions that go beyond what's in the standard intelligence reporting." Victor felt his throat tighten, but maintained his composure. "I synthesize multiple sources: signal intelligence, agent reports, open source material from Western publications. The conclusions follow from pattern analysis. Yes, I understand your methodology. But some of your recent assessments seem to anticipate American planning with unusual precision, almost as if you have access to their internal discussions." The accusation hung in the air, not quite spoken but clearly implied. Victor allowed himself to look slightly confused. "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting, Comrade Colonel." Zhukov stared at him for a long moment. Then he closed the file folder. "I'm not suggesting anything, Viktor Mikhailovich. I'm simply noting that your work has become exceptionally good. Keep it up, but be careful not to overreach. Sometimes analysts become too confident in their conclusions and present assessments as facts rather than educated guesses." "I understand. Good. That's all." Victor stood, nodded, and left the office. He walked to the bathroom, locked himself in a stall, and stood there for 5 minutes, breathing slowly, waiting for the adrenaline to subside. The message had been clear. Someone was watching his work closely enough to notice patterns. Whether that someone suspected actual compromise or simply thought Victor was becoming sloppy didn't matter. Either way, the scrutiny had increased. He needed to be more careful, or he needed to stop. That evening, Victor met with the British handler in a cafe near Belaruski Station. It was their first face-to-face contact in 2 months. Risky, but necessary given the new developments. "I think I'm being watched," Victor said quietly, stirring his tea without drinking it. "By whom?" "My department chief. He noticed that my analytical work has become too accurate." The handler frowned. "Have you been using information from documents you photographed in your own assessments?" "No, never. But I think I've been unconsciously adjusting my analysis based on what I know from your material. Making connections I wouldn't have made otherwise. That's a problem. I know." They sat in silence for a moment. Around them, the cafe buzzed with ordinary Moscow life. Workers having dinner after their shifts, students studying over cheap coffee, old women gossiping about neighbors. "We could end the arrangement," the handler said. "We've gotten valuable intelligence. Your wife is improving. You could walk away now before the risk increases." Victor considered this. Anna was in remission. The leukemia hadn't been cured, but it was controlled. With continued medication, she could live years, possibly decades. But the moment he stopped providing intelligence, the medication would stop arriving. "How long would she survive without the vincristine?" Victor asked. "I don't know. Months, perhaps. The leukemia would return. Then I can't stop. Even if it means increased risk of detection? Especially then. If I stop now, everything I've done becomes meaningless. I will have betrayed my country for nothing." The handler studied him carefully. "You understand that you're describing sunk cost fallacy. The fact that you've already committed treason doesn't obligate you to continue committing it." "This isn't about logic," Victor said. "It's about my wife's life. Your wife's life won't mean much if you're executed for treason. Perhaps not, but at least she'll be alive to mourn me." The handler sighed. "All right. Then we need to adjust operational security. Reduce the frequency of drops, vary the locations more, limit the volume of material. We can also explore other sources for the medication. Perhaps we could arrange delivery through a third party, separate from the intelligence arrangement." "That won't work. The whole point is the exchange. I provide value, you provide medication. If you're giving me medicine without intelligence in return, you're just running a charity operation, and eventually someone in London will question whether it's worth the risk and expense." The handler didn't deny this. "You're very clear-eyed about this," he said. "I've spent 14 years studying how intelligence operations work. I understand the economics. And knowing all that, you still want to continue?" Victor thought about Anna reading in bed. Her color returned, her smile genuine for the first time in months. He thought about the oncologist's cautious optimism. He thought about the possibility, slim but real, that she might actually survive this. "Yes," he said, "I want to continue." Through the summer and fall of 1983, Viktor Petrov maintained his double life with increasing precision and decreasing peace of mind. The geopolitical situation deteriorated steadily. In September, Soviet air defense forces shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after it strayed into restricted airspace near Sakhalin Island. 269 people died. The Reagan administration called it murder. The Soviet government claimed the plane was on a spy mission. Victor knew from intelligence he'd photographed but never seen analyzed that the incident was a catastrophic mistake, a combination of poor communication, technical errors, and paranoid assumptions by Soviet military commanders who genuinely believed the civilian airliner might be an American reconnaissance aircraft. He also knew that both sides were now so deeply suspicious of each other that mistakes like this could easily trigger actual conflict. In November, NATO conducted Able Archer 83, a command post exercise designed to practice nuclear release procedures. Soviet intelligence, already on edge after Cal 007, interpreted the exercise as possible cover for a real first strike. For several days, Soviet nuclear forces went on high alert. Victor watched these events unfold with the strange detachment of someone who possessed multiple layers of truth. He knew what the Soviet leadership believed. He knew what Western intelligence actually intended. He knew that the gap between these two realities was growing wider and more dangerous. And he knew that his own small betrayal, photographing documents, passing film cartridges, was helping to close that gap, giving Western analysts insight into Soviet thinking that might, possibly, prevent miscalculation. This didn't make him feel heroic. It made him feel exhausted. In December, Anna asked him a question he'd been dreading. They were having dinner in the apartment, a simple meal of soup and bread. Snow fell outside the windows, covering Moscow in white silence. "Victor," she said carefully, "where is this medicine really coming from?" He looked up from his soup. "I told you, a colleague with connections." "That's not true." "Anna, I'm not stupid. This medication doesn't exist in the Soviet Union. It can't be obtained through normal channels, even with connections. And you've been different lately. Distracted, worried, always checking over your shoulder. So I'll ask again, where is the medicine coming from?" Victor set down his spoon. He looked at his wife, her intelligent eyes, her thin face, the strength that remained despite everything the illness had taken. He could lie. He'd become very good at lying. But this was Anna. After 14 years of marriage, after everything they'd survived together, she deserved something closer to truth. "It's coming from the West," he said quietly, "through channels I can't discuss." "In exchange for what?" "Information." She absorbed this silently. Then, "Are you in danger?" "Not if I'm careful. But there is danger." "Yes." She reached across the table and took his hand. "Then stop. I don't want to live if it means you die. That's not your decision to make. It's my life you're saving." "Exactly. Your life. Which means I get to decide what price I'm willing to pay for it." "That's not how marriage works, Victor." "Then tell me how it works. Tell me how I'm supposed to sit here and watch you die when I have the ability to prevent it." Anna's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You're supposed to understand that some prices are too high, that I would rather die than know you were killed saving me. Then it's fortunate you won't know, because if I'm caught, they'll execute me quietly and tell you I died in an accident, or that I was transferred to another city, or any of a dozen other convenient lies. You'll never know the truth." "I'll know," she said. "I'll always know." They sat in silence, holding hands across the table, while the snow fell outside and the radiators clanked, and the building settled into its familiar night sounds. Finally, Anna spoke again. "Do you regret it? What you're doing?" Victor thought about this carefully. "I regret living in a country where saving your wife requires treason. I regret that loyalty to the state and loyalty to the people I love have become incompatible. But do I regret the choice itself? No. I'd make the same choice again. Even knowing what it costs? Especially knowing what it costs." January 1984 arrived with bitter cold and renewed paranoia. Yuri Andropov, the Soviet leader and former KGB chief, died on February 9th after only 15 months in power. He was replaced by Konstantin Chernenko, a 72-year-old apparatchik who was already visibly ill. The leadership instability created chaos in the Soviet bureaucracy. Different factions maneuvered for position. Old alliances shifted. People who had been protected suddenly found themselves vulnerable. In March, Colonel Vasily Zhukov called Victor to his office again. "I need you to do something for me, Viktor Mikhailovich," Zhukov said. "The second chief directorate has asked our department to review all personnel with access to sensitive American intelligence. Standard procedure during a leadership transition. They want to make sure no one has been compromised." Victor felt his stomach drop, but kept his expression neutral. "Of course. What do you need?" "I need you to write a detailed account of your work over the past year. Every project, every assessment, every document you've handled. Include information about your personal life, finances, relationships, any unusual activities. It's bureaucratic nonsense, but it has to be done. When do you need this?" 2 weeks. Victor nodded. "I'll have it ready." He left the office, walked to the bathroom, and vomited quietly into the toilet. This was it. The investigation he'd always known would eventually come. The question was whether he could survive it. For the next 2 weeks, Viktor Petrov wrote the most important document of his life, a comprehensive lie. He described his work in meticulous detail, presenting himself as a dedicated but unremarkable analyst who drew his conclusions from standard intelligence sources and careful synthesis. He included information about Anna's illness, acknowledging that he'd used personal connections to obtain medication, but presenting it as a matter of bureaucratic favor trading rather than espionage. He described his finances, his friendships, his daily routines, everything ordinary, everything explainable, everything designed to present a picture of a loyal officer who'd never entertained a disloyal thought. It was, in many ways, a masterpiece of defensive writing. Every statement was technically true while obscuring the larger truth. Every detail was verifiable while leading investigators away from what actually mattered. But Victor knew it might not be enough. The second chief directorate employed professional interrogators who'd spent careers identifying deception. They would review his statement, compare it against surveillance reports, look for inconsistencies. If they found anything suspicious, they would dig deeper. And if they dug deep enough, they would find the truth. On March 28, 1984, Victor submitted his report. On April 3rd, he was called in for an interview with a second chief directorate officer. The officer, a thin man named Sokolov, with colorless eyes and a bureaucrat's affect, spent 3 hours asking Victor questions about his work, his colleagues, his personal life. The questions seemed random, jumping from topic to topic without apparent logic. But Victor recognized the technique. They were looking for contradictions, places where his story didn't quite align with known facts. "You mentioned obtaining medication for your wife through personal connections," Sokolov said at one point. "Can you be more specific?" "A colleague knew a doctor with access to foreign pharmaceuticals. I asked for help. The colleague made an introduction, and I was able to obtain what my wife needed." "Which colleague?" Victor had anticipated this question. He named a mid-level officer in the 3rd Directorate who'd been transferred to Vladivostok 6 months earlier and had recently died in a car accident. "I see," Sokolov said, making a note. "And this doctor's name?" "He asked me not to use it. These arrangements are irregular." "Yes, they are. But we need to verify your story." "I understand. I wish I could be more helpful." The interview continued for another hour. Finally, Sokolov closed his notebook. "Thank you for your cooperation, Viktor Mikhailovich. We may have additional questions later." "Of course." Victor left the building, rode the metro home, and sat in his apartment, waiting. 3 weeks passed. Nothing happened. Victor continued his work, executed dead drops, photographed documents. Anna's condition remained stable. Life continued its strange dual rhythm, ordinary on the surface, terrifying underneath. Then, on April 30th, 1984, Victor arrived at work to find 2 men waiting outside his office. They weren't wearing uniforms, but he recognized them immediately. Second Chief Directorate, Arrest Team. "Viktor Mikhailovich Petrov," one of them said. "You are under arrest for high treason against the Soviet Union. Come with us immediately." Victor felt a strange calm settle over him. After months of anxiety, the waiting was finally over. "Can I get my coat?" he asked. "No." They escorted him out of the building, down to a basement garage, and into an unmarked black car. They drove through Moscow in silence, finally pulling into the underground entrance of Lefortovo prison. Lefortovo, where the KGB interrogated its most sensitive cases, where prisoners disappeared into the machinery of state security and emerged months or years later, broken, if they emerged at all. Victor was taken to a small cell, concrete walls, a metal bed frame, a bucket, no windows, a single dim bulb that burned continuously. He sat on the bed frame and waited for what would come next. The door opened. A man entered, older, wearing a colonel's uniform. He carried a file folder. "My name is Colonel Baranov," the man said. "I'll be conducting your interrogation. We have a great deal to discuss, Viktor Mikhailovich. A great deal." He opened the file folder. Inside were photographs. Victor entering Sokolniki Park. Victor sitting on a bench in Izmailovsky Park. Victor meeting with the British handler in the cafe near Belaruski Station. "We've been watching you for 11 months, Baranov said quietly. "We know everything. The only question now is whether you cooperate fully or we extract the information through less pleasant means. So I'll ask you once, clearly. Will you provide a complete confession, including the names of everyone involved in your treason?" Victor looked at the photographs, the evidence of his year-long betrayal laid out like a trial exhibit. He thought about Anna, safe in their apartment, her leukemia in remission, her life extended by the treason he'd committed. He thought about the British handler, whoever he was, safely back in London. He thought about Oleg Gordievsky, who'd made the initial introduction and was, presumably, still operating undetected. He thought about the oath he'd taken when he joined the KGB, and the promise he'd made when he married Anna, and how those two commitments had become impossible to reconcile. And then Viktor Petrov, senior intelligence analyst and traitor to the Soviet Union, looked at Colonel Baranov and spoke his final truth. Yes, I'll tell you everything. The interrogation lasted 63 days. Victor told them everything they asked: his recruitment by British intelligence, the dead drop locations, the documents he'd photographed, the tradecraft he'd learned. He held back only two things: Gordievsky's name, which he claimed not to know, and the fact that Anna had eventually guessed the truth. On July 6, 1984, a military tribunal convicted Viktor Petrov of high treason under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code. The trial lasted 4 hours and was closed to the public. The sentence was death by firing squad. The execution took place on July 15th in the basement of Lubyanka, carried out with bureaucratic efficiency by officers who'd performed this duty hundreds of times before. Victor's last thought, they say, though of course no one could know, was of Anna reading in bed, her color returned, alive. 3 months later, Anna Petrova received a letter from the KGB informing her that her husband had died in a training accident. The letter expressed the state's condolences and noted that Victor had been a loyal officer who served with distinction. She never learned the truth, or perhaps she did, and simply carried it in silence for the rest of her life, which ended peacefully in 1997, 13 years after her husband's execution. The British intelligence officer who'd recruited Victor was never identified. MI6 closed the file, grateful for the intelligence they'd obtained, but aware that the human cost had been, as always, paid by someone else. The documents Victor photographed contributed to Western understanding of Soviet military planning during one of the Cold War's most dangerous periods. Whether this intelligence prevented a crisis or simply added detail to an already complex picture, no one could say. History doesn't work in counterfactuals, but we can say this: Viktor Petrov betrayed his country not for ideology or money or principle, but for love, and in the end, that love kept one person alive while ending his own life. Whether that was worth it is not a question history can answer. It's the kind of question every person must answer for themselves, usually in moments when the choice becomes impossible to avoid, when loyalty divides against itself, when duty conflicts with devotion, when the only way forward requires betraying something you once believed was sacred. The Cold War produced thousands of stories like Victor's, people caught between competing truths, forced to choose which version of loyalty would define them, aware that every choice carried a cost they couldn't fully anticipate. Most of those stories remain classified, buried in archives that may never be opened. But they happened, and they reveal something essential about that era: that the real war wasn't fought between ideologies or superpowers, but within the hearts of individuals who discovered, too late, that the systems they served didn't serve them back. If you found this story worth remembering, consider subscribing. The Cold War left behind countless stories of ordinary people forced into impossible choices, stories that reveal more about courage, love, and betrayal than any official history ever could. These voices from the past deserve to be heard before they disappear completely into the archives of a war that ended, but whose wounds still shape the world we live in today.